The following interview was conducted as part of the Price of Freedom project by the Madison County Military Heritage Commission to inform and enlighten young people and the community as a whole about the sacrifices made by those in the military on battlefields around the world. We wish to thank the Huntsville School System and the Lehigh Broadcast Center for their help in presenting this military heritage program. Hello, I'm Tom Kennemer. Welcome to our program. Today we'll be talking with U.S. Army veteran Larry Wyenandt. Larry is the recipient of 2 awards of the Army Commendation Medal with Valor for his gallantry in action during combat on the battlefields of Vietnam. Larry was inducted into the Hall of Heroes in 2012 and presently serves on the Board of Directors for the Madison County Military Heritage Commission. Larry, it's a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Thank you for your time.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Appreciate you being with us. Now, before we talk about your service, military service, tell us a little about yourself. You're originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I understand you come from a big family, right?
Cincinnati, Ohio. Born and raised in Cincinnati in a big family. My mother had 9 children in 10 years back then, and I'm the oldest, but I was adopted.
I see.
And the rest of my siblings are all, my stepdad and my mom. They were rather big kids. I mean, we were all big. My dad was 6'4", my mom was 5'1", and
she was contrast there.
She was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was an electrician, and we weren't wealthy by no means. Right. And he had a station wagon, and we'd pile in the station wagon, and we have to go to Indiana to buy groceries.
Really?
Because it was a whole lot cheaper than Cincinnati. And the taxes,
across the river.
And the taxes were different. That's what we did. Yeah.
Now, did you have family members, brothers, sisters? Your dad, was he in the military?
Yes, sir. My father was in World War II. He was in the Army Air Corps, and he was in Guam during the war. And I really didn't know much about what he did, because he never talked about it, just like I don't talk about Vietnam.
Right.
When my father passed, my stepdad, I got all his things, his military things, and I started reading them and to find out what he did. And it was absolutely amazing to me what the man did. And I shared that with my brothers and gave them copies of his pictures and stuff, which we weren't allowed to have when we were kids. My younger brother, he's about 3 years younger than I am, he was a Navy SEAL. He was a SEAL for 22 years, and he was stationed in Treasure Island in California, and he was an instructor. I have another little brother that joined the Navy, and he really didn't get along with the Navy life. And so they gave him a general discharge to get him out and let him go on with life.
I see. Now, when you were going to school, Larry, did you have any thoughts of going into the military?
Well, you have to remember the mid-'60s. The mid-'60s was a lot of riots. There was race riots. There was all this dissension. There was guys that talked about being conscious objectors that wanted to go to Canada rather than serve their country. And if you didn't, in my high school in senior year, if you were enrolled in college and you were drafted, got your draft notice, you were gone.
Right. Now, and you were drafted right out of school, right?
I was drafted. Well, I got my draft notice in school. I turned 18 in April, and in May I got my draft notice. And June 26th, I believe, I left for service. But the recruiter talked me into enlisting for another year to go to school, to Army Air Defense Missile School in Texas. And I said, I'm in, fine.
Sure. Okay. And you were like, what did you say earlier, number 3 on the draft list or something like that?
3 in the draft, in the lottery yet. It was early.
That's a pretty good number, isn't it?
It was that number that you didn't have a choice.
That's right. That was close. Now, where did you go to boot camp, and what was that like for you?
Well, they put you on a bus. First you take your swearing in at the courthouse, which you know, and then they put you on a bus, and I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And my first experience was you go into the front gate, and they ask you, they see your orders, where you're going to go, and they put you in a car or a bus and take you to there. So I go to the day room at where I'm stationed to be, and I walk in and say, where am I supposed to go? Here's my orders, da-da-da. He said, well, you go down to the 4th barracks on the left, and just put your duffel bag on one of the beds that's not occupied. You'll know which one's not occupied. I said, okay. So, Tom, I walk in that thing, and it's a 2-story building, and I'm walking down the center of this thing, okay? I get almost to the end, and I hear this guy say, stop. What are you doing walking on my floor? And I got my duffel bag, and it's my first day of boot camp, and I turn around and look, and all my footprints were on the floor.
Oh, man.
And he said to me, he says, go ahead, son. He called me son. Put your duffel bag on the bed and I want you to come up here and get a buffer, and you're going to buff this floor the way it was before you messed it
Wow.
up. That was my first
That
day.
was a quick lesson.
Oh,
wasn't
yeah.
it? Now, you mentioned you went to school, or that you signed up to go to school. Well, what were you trained as in the Army, and what did you do?
Well, that's kind of interesting. After I got out of boot camp, you get your orders to go to AIT, which is training for the service.
Right.
And I got my notice to go to combat engineers in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And I went into the sergeant and with my orders and asked to see the captain, and I said, I'm supposed to go to Air Defense Missile School in Texas. He said, son, that school's full. You have to go to Fort Leonard Wood. So I couldn't go back on the recruiter. I had to go to Fort Leonard Wood.
Right.
Well, Fort Leonard Wood is noted for being Little Korea, where it's ice cold. And there's nothing in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. There's a stoplight and a don't walk and walk sign, I think.
Not very much excitement.
Not very much.
There
was a movie theater, a jewelry store, and there was a YMCA that we could go to.
Yeah. How long did you stay there, or were you stationed?
About 90 days for training. You stayed here about 3 months, and they taught you to build bridges over water, build buildings out of, and covering them up, and this for GIs and base camps, really, for Vietnam.
Right. Now, Larry, did you go immediately to Vietnam from Leonard Wood?
No, from Fort Leonard Wood, I got orders to go to Fort Eustis, Virginia, to an aviation material lab.
Wow.
Which was a building where they built stuff out of wood, okay? And it was all secret, you had to have a clearance and all this kind of thing. And I had a good time in Fort Eustis. It was, the Hampton Bridge tunnels was there, Williamsburg College was there, Chesapeake Bay Tunnel was there, 16 miles underwater. It's quite an experience, but Fort Eustis was good.
Yeah, pretty good place to be stationed.
Oh, I thought I was safe.
Yeah. Larry, you touched on this a little bit earlier. At the time you served in the Army, there were protests against our country's involvement in Vietnam. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I really didn't want to think about it because of everything that was going on, and I really didn't have. I got a letter of intent to go to University of Cincinnati, but my family didn't have the money, and they weren't going to give me. All they wanted to do is give you a scholarship for books, and my dad told me I couldn't do that. So, what I did was graduated, and graduation ceremony got moved because of the race riots. We were supposed to go here, and they moved us here because of the race riots downtown Cincinnati. And that's the real time I thought about the Army. I said, well, I've got no choice. I have to do something. And so I was talking to a recruiter, and that's when I started.
I see. Now, when you got to Vietnam, where were you stationed, and what was it like?
Well, that's another story. On the plane going to Vietnam, I tried to sit by somebody that had been there before to kind of tell me
pass along some experience.
What I can expect, exactly.
Yeah, sure.
So as we're flying over, he said, look out the window, and what do you see? I looked out the window of the plane, and I see smokestacks coming all over the place. And I said, what's a smokestack? What's all that smoke? He said, they have to burn human waste. I said, what? He said, yeah, because of the rice paddies is so wet, there was no place to bury it, so they cut a 55-gallon drum in half and poured diesel fuel on it, and there was the privates had to burn waste every day. And so then we get to where the Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Vietnam in the first night, and we get mortared.
What year was this now, Larry?
68.
68. Okay, yeah, okay.
It was December of 68. And we get mortared, and we don't have any rifles, we don't have any guns, we don't have a bunker to go to, and we're in a place to sleep overnight. So I wrote my congressman. And I said, this is what your Ohio boys go through when they land in Vietnam. And I explained the whole thing. Well, I didn't think nothing of it, and I mailed it,
Yeah.
So the next day I go to a place called Tan An, which is in Dong Tan Province, which is in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, which is south of Saigon, to an artillery unit, a 105.
Now, once you got settled in country, what was your daily routine like? And what did you do?
Well, I was E4 at that time when I got there, and like a corporal.
Right.
And our duties were to clean all the equipment, the guns. You had to clean a Jeep. You had to clean a 3/4 ton. You had to make sure we had enough ammunition to man that pit when if we got gunfire. We had to return fire or have to back up the infantry.
I see.
And that's most of the time is what you did. Your downtime was always always on alert. I mean, you really didn't have as much downtime you have. You usually want to drink something.
Right, I see.
But you couldn't get too drunk.
I see. Now, what location in Vietnam were you at? Right?
Tan An.
Okay, Tan An.
Tan An,
and that's in southern part of your Saigon, in that general area?
below Saigon in the
Okay.
Mekong Delta. In other words, it was the DMZ's north and the Mekong Delta's south.
Okay.
We were closer to Laos and Cambodia.
Larry, let's get back to something. Did you ever hear back from that congressman?
Well, it's funny you ask.
Yeah.
About 3 months in country, this captain comes up to me and says, "We have to go see the general." And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "What's this about?" He said, "Well, just make sure your shoes are spit shine and,
You look good.
and you look good."
Yeah.
I said, "Okay." So we go there, and this guy had a copy of my letter from the state representative in Ohio.
Okay.
And he read it verbatim, and he says, "We've rectified that problem." He said, "Now we put them in bunkers. We built bunkers that they can go in bunkers at night because of what you wrote."
Yeah.
And I said, "That's amazing. Thank
Now,
you."
they may have gotten around that sooner or later, but because of what you did prompted that. Larry.
Exactly,
And you may
exactly.
save some lives.
I
your-
hope
your
so,
effort. Yeah.
because I was scared to death.
Yeah.
I mean,
sure.
you're
and others were too, I'm
yeah,
sure.
you're 19 years old and
Yeah.
you're sleeping in this bunk and you hear a mortar and you've never heard a mortar before, Tom.
Right, yeah.
And it scares you to death.
Yeah. Now, talk about being away from home while you were in the military. How did it affect your family? And were you married at that time?
No, Tom, I wasn't married. I had a girlfriend, which I think everybody did at that time. The day I left, my father drove me to the airport, and he told me a couple things about service. First thing he said was, "Don't make friends." He said, because what happens if that friend gets killed, you're tore up and you don't have your head on straight if you get, have a conflict.
Right.
I said, "Okay, Dad, I'll remember that." And then he gave me some other instructions, and I said, "Fine." He started a beard the day I left. He shaved it off the day I got home.
Really?
They also set up, the Christmas tree was set up, because I left in December.
Right.
The old aluminum Christmas tree, and
Oh,
they
yeah.
had that reflector light with 3 colors,
Yeah.
green, blue, and red.
That was the 60s staple.
Yeah, that was a 60s thing. But my family told me that they watched the news every night to see what province was, every day there was people
Yeah.
getting killed, every day.
Yeah,
I don't think a day went by.
Heavy action during when you were over there. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, now you just touched on friendships. You formed some relationships in the service. Do you still stay in contact with any of those people and any of your friends?
My gunner that worked for me because I got promoted as a sergeant and a section chief, and my gunner, he and I became close. He's the only guy I still stay in contact to this day. And usually we call each other around Veterans Day and we do FaceTime. This year we talked for 2.5 hours.
Wow.
And we talked about VA, we talked about her family, we talked about his wife, and we're getting old.
When they weren't, shooting at you and throwing the mortars at you and so forth, what could you do to relax? How did you kind of get your mind away from combat?
Tom, I really don't think that there was a time that you could totally relax because you were always on guard, first of all, because you couldn't recognize who was the bad guy because they all looked alike. They all wore black pajamas. You try to have some way to walk around the camp because it was like being in jail. You couldn't go nowhere.
Right.
You couldn't get in the car and go. I mean, you were stuck in that base camp, and that's what you did. Yeah. We had a spa that you could go to, and if you wanted to, which I didn't. And we set up a little basketball net. And I mean, it was, kind of, it wasn't well made.
Right, yeah.
But there again, and we played cards. I mean, every Army or every serviceman played cards, Tonk or whatever it was.
Right,
or,
yeah.
We
Trying
all
to
did
get
it.
your mind
Trying
away
to get
from
your
it.
mind, yeah.
Sure, get your mind away from it.
But
Yeah.
alcohol came into play a lot.
Yeah.
And when you had the downtime, you were talking about relax.
Yeah.
But you didn't want to think about the war.
Right, yeah. We didn't have email, or you couldn't text anyone back then, of course, but were you able to get regular mail from time to time? How often was that?
Mail call was about every other day.
Okay.
It wasn't a daily routine, and I was always waiting for my mother to send me a care package.
Right.
And it was always, somebody had always opened it before I got it, and I was looking for talcum powder. Talcum powder kept you dry because you couldn't wear underwear because it was too hot and you get scalded and you were wet all the time.
Extremely humid there,
Extremely
too.
humid,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I look forward to my mother's stuff and this.
Right.
And the girlfriend at the time, she didn't write maybe once every 2 weeks or so because she was in college and she was busy.
Sure.
But she did. I look forward to those letters now. My sisters, never heard from them. My brothers, never heard from them.
Really?
No.
I see.
No.
No cell phones at that time. Did you occasionally get to talk to your anybody back home, or did you try to phone them or anything?
There was no way to call from the base camp.
Okay.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what I did was, an R&R, you got to go in R&R, and the most time you had, you could pick where you wanted to go.
Yeah.
So naturally, I wanted to go to Australia. So 10 months in country, I went to Australia, and that's the first time I got to pick up a phone and call home.
Well, R&R.
R&R after 10 months, yes,
Right.
sir.
I know you're mostly in combat zone during your stay in Vietnam. Of course, that's never pleasant, of course. But do you have is there a favorite memory, Larry, that comes to mind or serving in Vietnam or in the Army?
Well, the favorite memory was my captain came up to me one day and said that they wanted to open another base camp about 20 miles away from where we were, because our 105s would only shoot 9 miles, was the capacity they would go.
Yeah.
So he said, you were a combat engineer, MOS, which is what I was trained to do. He says, I want you to build a mess hall for this base camp. And I said, and he says, I'll give you a team of guys to help you. I said, okay, when are we going to do it? He said, a couple weeks. So I go to build this mess hall, and Tom, we built this mess hall in 55-gallon drums that we had to secure in this mud of the rice paddies.
Wow.
And after I built this mess hall, I guess it took about 5 to 7 days, you know, we were finished, and we put a name on it. You know, I put my initials on it and all that kind of stuff. The very next day, Charlie blew it up.
Goodness.
The next day he blew that thing to Kingdom Come. They were watching us build that thing.
When you were building it, did you have any combat action?
We had a patrol that stayed and watched us, because I mean, you're building something, you can't see it around.
You're open,
You're out there in the open.
Yeah.
We had a rocket attack one day. Somebody shot a rocket at us, and I don't know if you remember, but the rockets, they set them on 2 sticks. Remember?
Yeah.
And they would shoot them at you, but they couldn't aim very well.
Right. Yeah.
And luckily it went over where we were.
Fortunately, right.
Fortunately.
You're in different parts of the country, and if you describe the areas you're in. I mean, Vietnam really is it's a pretty country, isn't it?
It's pretty, but you really didn't get into the aesthetics of the country because of trying to keep your butt down and try to stay dry.
Right.
When you went out in the bivouac and go out on these rice paddies in the dikes, they were called dikes, and the water was 3 foot deep at least, you know, about knee deep.
Right.
And like I said, you didn't know who the enemy was, and it was pretty. I wasn't near the mountains. I was near the delta and a river, and you know the river's pretty.
Right.
But as far as the country itself, you know, I won't go back.
Right. As we mentioned earlier, you were awarded 2 Army Commendation Medals with valor for your service in Vietnam. Tell us about the battles or combat action that led to you receiving these Valor Awards.
Well, the first one was February 9th, I believe, and we had a ground attack. And I don't know if you're familiar with a ground attack on a base camp. All of a sudden, when you shoot white phosphorus in the air to illuminate what's going up in front of you, all you saw was Vietnamese coming at you with rifles and shooting.
Right.
Well, the quad 40s were going off, and you're shooting direct fire out of a 105 howitzer, it's called, and we shot beehive rounds. A beehive round is a little darts, steel darts that are in this canister, and they shoot at a 50-yard radius, and they're designed to keep people off the concertina wire from getting in your base camp. Because your biggest fear was being captured.
Right.
You did not want to be a POW or get killed, for that matter.
Right.
Well, we were shooting at them, and mortars came in, and a mortar hit my pit, my gun pit, and I got a little shrapnel in the back. At the same time, I was awarded that night my first accommodation. A gentleman was drunk in a bunker that didn't make it out to the pit, and he fell over a bunk, and this young man got a Purple Heart. And when they wanted to give me a Purple Heart, I told him I didn't want it because of my experience with this young man. In fact, he went to jail because of what he did, but he got a Purple Heart. But that experience there was pretty traumatic, because if you don't shoot that gun, and as a matter of fact, I returned fire by myself because they were scared to death.
Right.
And when you're shooting that gun by yourself, you're not thinking of anything but getting the job done to protect your rear end.
Right. Yeah.
Well, the second time was in, I believe, in August, and there again it was another rocket attack. And the worst sound in the world you want to hear is a rocket coming at you. I mean, you hear guns, you know, the M47s and all those kind of things, the M16s, the quad 40s, and 105s, 155s. But the worst sound an American wants to hear is a rocket coming at him. You don't forget that sound. This rocket hit our mess hall. And so right away we had to return fire. There again, we took a direct hit. Another gun pit took a direct hit. So we had to move our gun to his pit to return fire. And that's when I was awarded another commendation, because there again, I ran up by myself. Because you have to return fire. If you don't return fire, you're in deep doo-doo.
This obviously was your most fearful time in Vietnam, wouldn't you say, during these 2 periods?
Most fearful, I wouldn't call it most fearful. I would call it, reaction to where you were trained.
Right.
I mean, if you were a man that was afraid would get killed.
Right.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
And I was taught that you don't want to be afraid because you do your job.
Right. We can look back to family members or a tough sergeant in boot camp for who best prepared you to take the actions you did in combat. Who do you think back and helped you the most to prepare yourself to stay alive and make it back from Vietnam?
Well, in basic training, I had 2 sergeants, and they were both black gentlemen,
Yeah.
and both of them were 16 to 20 years in service, and they had been to Vietnam, and they would point to the guys in the line and say, "Look at the guy next to you, that you won't see him in 6 months. He'll be dead in Vietnam." So they embedded this in you to protect your rear end.
Mm-hmm.
You had PT, and you hold your arms out. They would hold their arms out longer than you would.
Right.
And one night they took us to a firing range where they shot live rounds over you, where you had to go under this wire to make sure you kept your butt down.
Mm-hmm.
I think those 2 guys are more influential of my reactions to Vietnam than anybody was, because AIT training was a combat engineer. I mean, they're not teaching you any kind of combat issues at all.
Right.
And in basic, you're taught like how to do camouflage. If you're in the bush, that you have to, the gooks are going to come at you, and you got to be able to hide yourself.
Right.
And those 2 sergeants did a great job, and their names were Sergeant White and Sergeant Black.
Never forget their
Never
names,
forget that. No, sir.
Like my DIs.
That's right. You won't forget them because they were impressionable to you.
That's right.
You're 19 years old,
Yeah.
and you don't know a whole lot.
That's right. Larry, how would you describe to young people what it's like to serve in a war zone, the thoughts you have of possibly being killed or wounded during a battle?
And I think that's a natural reaction, young people, because of the fear of the unknown. I mean, you're taught, yes, but still there's this uncertainty of what you're going to face when you go out there. Young people, all they can go by is what somebody else tells them, or what history books tell them, or what's on the television that tells them what happened previously. They can research that to try to familiarize themselves with fear and with what happens. They're better off that way.
I know people often wonder, is it okay to be afraid or scared during combat? You've, of course, been in combat. How would you answer that?
I would say yes. There again, it's something that as a human being you're going to have because of, there again, fear of the unknown.
Right.
You don't have any idea. And to be afraid is a natural, like love. Being in love is a emotion. Being afraid is an emotion, and you just got to suck it up and do your job.
And it could possibly help save your life. Right?
Exactly.
It has
Exactly. Because like we talked about before,
You're
being
on guard.
afraid,
Yeah.
being afraid is not a good thing. That's why you get yourself killed.
You've served during a war, and you've probably seen a few movies and TV shows depicting combat. Are those shows generally realistic?
It's funny you ask that. I waited probably 15 to 20 years before I watch any of them. I just couldn't. I don't eat rice today. I sit in the back of a room. I have to see an exit door. I don't go near big crowds. I stay in the back. I don't like confrontations. Those kind of things.
Right.
But as far as anything else, as far as what was the question again?
Well, it's like you served during the war. Is TV shows about combat?
Movies, okay.
Yeah.
The first movie I saw was Platoon.
Right.
And Platoon was right on. I mean, even to when they captured a young man and what they did to him, to leave a message to the guys that were behind him to say, hey, this could happen to you. The dissension in ranks. I mean, in combat, there was always dissension. I mean, you think we'd go like this, down the line? Nah, there was always dissension. This guy, I thought he was better than that guy.
Yeah.
Those kind of things.
Yeah.
But Apocalypse Now, no. That to me, that was a bunch of garbage.
Glorified.
And the same with Full Metal Jacket. Now, I wasn't in the North where that was filmed,
Right.
that hill, and like Hamburger Hill. Those guys were different than what we did. We had more wetlands and rice. They had more mountainous territory and jungle. Right. We had the jungle and the wetland.
Do you often wonder, would you do it all over again?
If my country asked me to, I would, yes. There's no doubt. And the thing that burns me the worst is to see somebody burn an American flag. I mean, it just goes right to my heart. I can't take it. I mean, and I'd hate to be in front of somebody that did that because I don't know what reaction I'd have. And I hate to be there.
It was not an easy time for you after serving in Vietnam and leaving the Army. Talk about some of the problems you encountered.
Well, my biggest problem, I think, was drinking. I would try to drink Tom, as much as I could to pass out. So I wouldn't have the nightmares, the night sweats, the waking up in the middle of the night. Once you're awake, you're alert. If you would hear anything in the house at all, any kind of noise, you were up.
Yeah.
And once you're up at 3 o'clock in the morning, you cannot go back to sleep. I can't. And I think that was my biggest thing was alcohol. I had, I won't go into a lot of it, but I had 4 DUIs. And after, I should have had 4,044. But back then the police would take you home, and I had a lot of family members that were police officers. My sister, my uncle, and my cousins were all police officers in Cincinnati. So I had a lot of clout that I could call them and say, hey, guys I went to school with. But then when Mothers Against Drunk Driving come out, the police were held accountable. They had to arrest you. So after the 4th DUI, I went into rehab. And I was working for General Motors then, and I went into rehab, and I thought I lost my home, I thought I lost my job, I thought I lost my family. I mean, I was at the bottom. I thought of everything. When the first night in rehab, they put me out on some kind of drugs because I was drunk. I went straight from the police station to rehab, and I was drunk, and they knocked me out. Well, in the middle of the night, I felt something on my arm, and the guy was trying to take my blood pressure. And I didn't know who it was, and I didn't know where I was. And I grabbed this young man, and I was going to throw him through the window because I didn't know who he was. Well, all of a sudden, the lights go on, and nurses come in. Larry, put him down. They didn't want me to do something to him. But that rehabilitation on not drinking turned me into Alcohol Anonymous. And I've been sober now 29 years, and I give that all to that rehab of me stopping drinking. Because I was on a collision course. I was either going to kill somebody or be killed, because I didn't care, Tom. I didn't care about nobody. And if you got my way, it was tough.
Pulled yourself out of it.
Exactly, exactly.
Now you mentioned General Motors. You worked with them out of service. What brought you to the Huntsville area, and who were you working for then?
Well, I'll give you a little background. When you get out of the Army, you can collect unemployment, and I collected unemployment for 6 months, and you had to go to three applications a week, I think, to get your unemployment. I had a beard and dirty blue jeans, and my girlfriend wanted to go downtown Cincinnati. I said, I'm going to go by this bank and put an application in. So I went by this bank, went to personnel, and I took their little test, and I didn't think nothing of it. 3 days later, they called me and said, you have to clean up, wear a suit, and we're going to put you in the collection department at First National Bank of Cincinnati.
Oh, wow.
And I told my dad, I said, I got a job. He said, you're kidding? I said, no. So I was in collections and worked there about 3.5 years. And then I got burnt out on that a little bit. So then I worked for a car dealership in Cincinnati. And there again, I did F&I, finance and insurance with them. And I stayed there about 3.5 years. But what I did there, I would go to different dealerships that they own and put out fires. Customers had complaints. And you've been to a dealership where there's complaints. And once I left there, in January of 1997, we had a blizzard in Cincinnati. And we had 6-foot snow drifts. And if you didn't have studded snow tires or chains, you could not go on public streets. Well, I had just bought a new Cutlass, and I had studded snow tires. So my buddy, he had 2 sports cars, and they couldn't start them in this minus 50-degree weather.
Wow.
And we had electric dipsticks up there to keep the oil warm so you try to start your car. Well, he couldn't start them. So he says, Larry says, can you come and give me a tow? We'll start these, kickstart them, because they were both 4 speeds. Well, I got on a 4-lane highway from his house, and there was by a graveyard, and there was a bus stop that was an indentation. So I pulled over in this bus stop knowing I had room. The car started, and I walked back to his car, and I said, I'll take the chain off, and we'll go back to the house, and we'll go get something to eat. Okay, fine. So I go to my car, my window was down, and I reached in my left hand to turn the car off so I could get in the trunk. As I turned around, I got hit by a car. He sideswiped my car, and I had a split second to do something, Tom, and I jumped. And I broke this leg. I tore off the sports mirror with this arm. My keys were in the graveyard. I had broke my hip. I separated my pelvic bone. I had multiple scratches and bruises and blood all over the place. But anyway, long story short, I stayed 6 months in the hospital. Not 6 months. 6 weeks in the hospital on a body cast. Didn't walk for 6 months. So lost my job. Didn't work. Didn't have a job. And so about a year of convalescing, I finally got a job. I went to an employment agency, and I was a recruiter. So it was kind of like, getting you a job, trying to help you get a job. So I didn't really like that, but I knew the man that owned it, and he was helping me out, giving me a job. Well, all of a sudden this job comes across my desk, at GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation, of being a field representative. And I read the qualification. I went, I can do this job.
Yeah.
So I called them up, set up an interview on a Friday when I left the bank. They hired me on the spot.
Wow.
Because they had won some kind of contest and they needed people now.
Right.
So that was in August of 1978. I got a job. So I retired in 2010 after 32 years of working for them.
Wow.
And it was quite an experience.
Yeah, good.
But to get back to where I got here,
yeah.
they were closing out a branch in Cincinnati. They were GM wanted to close a bunch of brick and mortar places and be downsized.
Right.
This is when all the big companies were doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So they asked for volunteers to go to Charlotte. Well, I was in the middle of a divorce, and I needed to change a venue,
Okay.
and I just had to, you know. So I raised my hand to go to Charlotte. Well, Pat, my girlfriend at the time, which is now my wife, she wants to go to Gulf Shores and meet her mom and dad. So I said, okay, fine. So we go to Gulf Shores, and the next day we play golf and get home. There's a message from my boss in Cincinnati on my father-in-law's recorder, my recorder at home, my telephone, that he wanted me to call him right away. So I called him the next morning. Yeah. It was too late in the day to call him.
Right.
In. So I called him up and I said, Mr. Lucas, this is Larry. He said, he just said to me, he says, how does Birmingham, Alabama sound? I said, okay, when do I have to be there? He said, in 2 weeks. I said, I'm in Gulf Shores. I got to sell a house. I got to get a place to live. I got to do all this. He said, well, I'll tell him you'll be there in 2 weeks, and he hung up. So we cut our vacation off. We head to Birmingham, and I find a place to stay. I'm not going to buy a house because I don't know the lay of the land.
Right.
Okay, we don't know what a good place to live and all this. So I rented a townhouse, opened a checking account at South Trust Bank, and head back to Cincinnati. We put our home on sale on a fax machine to a realtor in Cincinnati. So 2 weeks later, I report to GMAC in Birmingham. I worked there 5 years from 94 to 99, and then I got promoted to run North Alabama and go to Huntsville, Alabama. So naturally, I accepted, and back then I got like a 16% raise, which is unbelievable to get that kind of raise.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So I was a supervisor, and we closed that branch from 1999 to 2001. They closed that branch, and then I started working out of my home. Well, when I first came to Alabama, Tom, we had 263 employees at GMAC in the state of Alabama. When I worked out of my home, we had 11.
Wow.
In the state of Alabama. Exactly.
Wow, that's something.
But that's what brought me to Alabama.
I see. Tell us a little about your family. You have 3 daughters, right?
3 daughters. My oldest is 42 by my first wife, and my second 2 daughters are by my second wife. My first daughter is 42, my second daughter is 34, my third daughter is 31. She'll be 32 next month. My oldest daughter doesn't have children. My middle daughter, she followed me in the banking business. She works for Eagle Savings and Loan in Cincinnati, and she's second in command there. I'm really proud of her. She's doing good.
Very
She
good.
had a set of twins, a boy and a girl, which I'm, as you know, grandkids.
They're the boss.
They're the boss. And then my youngest daughter, she doesn't want to get married, and she followed me again. She works at a car dealership as an office manager.
Right. I see.
So I'm proud of those kids.
Yeah, I know you are.
I'm sure my alcoholic days got rid of those 2 women. And I have made amends with them, both of them, and told them that, you have to understand alcoholism first.
Right.
And if you don't understand how that has a person, you can't understand why I'm making amends that I am. And so it's good. It's good.
As we mentioned earlier, you're on the board of directors of the Madison County Military Heritage Commission, and you're involved with other military organizations as well. Larry, what has that kind of involvement meant to you, and why is it important to continue to serve?
Well, it's there again, like you mentioned before about me watching a movie and the depiction of these movies. Well, I didn't get involved with any Vietnam thing. I wouldn't tell people I was there. I didn't own a Vietnam hat. I would not get involved. And one day I got a little letter that invite me to be inducted into Madison County Hall of Heroes. And I asked the young man, Steve Ray, I think was his name, asked him who gave him my name. And he says, we can't tell you that Dave wants you to induct you. So long story short, after my induction, which was a humbling experience, and my daughters come down, my daughters sat at that table, Tom, and they both cried because they never knew what their dad did in Vietnam.
You didn't know about your dad.
I didn't know about my dad. It's the same thing.
Sure.
And they both were in tears, and they had no idea. So after that, I told Mr. Dunn that I wanted to be a volunteer and help the Madison County Hall of Heroes because it opened my eyes that, yes, we're finally, after 50 years or so, let's say 45 years, of being recognized and felt welcomed home. Now, Ohio didn't do anything like this, but Alabama did, especially Huntsville.
Right.
And then I joined, there was a gentleman there that asked me to join the local chapter of Huntsville Vietnam Veterans of America.
Right.
And I kind of hesitated because I didn't want to get involved again,
Right.
you see.
Right.
So I told him I'd come to a meeting. He said, just come to a meeting and see what we
Right.
do.
Yeah.
So I went to the meeting, and then I went to a second meeting. And they meet once a month. And I enjoyed some of the people there, and we had the same experience. Well, this one gentleman came up to me, and he was in the same division I was in at the same time in Vietnam, but at a different base camp.
Small world.
Small
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
So he told me about his involvement, and I should join.
Yeah.
So I joined them. And I sat in the back, you know, looking at the exit door like I always
Yeah,
do,
yeah.
and would just listen. And I don't judge people at all right
Yeah.
away, you know. And I enjoyed the guy that ran it. I mean, he was in the Army, he was in the Marines, and he was a career man, Army, and I enjoyed him.
Yeah.
So I got involved with them. They had functions, the Veterans Parade, they Welcome Home Vietnam Veterans event at the memorial we just did last Saturday. We feed Tut Van. We go to Tut Van,
Right.
which are they're servicemen with disabilities.
Right, yeah.
And they have nowhere to go.
Yeah.
So Tut Van, we have a house that they
good
have 12
organization.
beds. They have 12 beds.
Yeah.
We go to the soup kitchen and we feed homeless people.
Yeah.
And we go out and we search for homeless Vietnam vets and try to help them. And the biggest thing we do now, Tom, as we just started, is helping these guys that you have to understand, it's 50 years later now,
Right.
that never filed a claim of PTSD,
Right.
post-traumatic stress disorder.
It's always been available.
And
to
it's
them,
always
yeah,
been
right.
available, yeah,
Right.
and Agent Orange.
Right,
Go back to those two things.
Yeah.
And these guys really didn't know, and I never would file a claim because I thought there was other guys out there that needed that more than
More
I
deserving,
did.
yeah.
That were wounded. You see what I'm saying, Tom?
Yeah, sure.
And couldn't work no more, this kind of thing. And so finally a buddy of mine came down, we were going to Talladega, and he was a Vietnam vet, and he came down from Cincinnati. We were all going to the race together, and he had a pamphlet. And he had it highlighted. And he handed it to me, and he said, Larry, he said, I want you to see this. I said, okay, because he knew me. I've known him for 40 years. And he said, this is you. Everything I've highlighted is you. Anger, resentment, isolation, all these things, you know.
Right.
He said, this is all you. You need to file a claim. I said, Donnie, there's other people that need it more than I do.
Right.
He said, Larry, he says, no, you need to file a claim. Promise me you'll file a claim.
Right.
So I waited 6 months. And I went to Birmingham and I filed a claim. Well, that was a fiasco by all means.
Yeah.
I could tell you more about
Right,
that
yeah.
in about 2 hours, but to this day I'm still fighting VA. In fact,
see.
I'm going Friday to VA, and it's sad to me that the government, our government, can't give a Vietnam vet or any veteran for that matter a card and say you can go to any hospital if you need it.
Right. I hope you get it worked out, Larry.
Get it
I
worked
sure
out.
do.
Thank
Yeah,
you. I
yeah.
appreciate that.
What would you like for young people, especially our students, to learn and hopefully remember from your military experience?
Well, the first and most important, I think, is let them know that freedom is not free. That there's sacrifices by people. In fact, 58,000 guys got killed in Vietnam, and we still have 1,406 guys that are missing in action, POW, that they've sacrificed for these kids to be in school. And, you know, continue their education, and service will always be there. And hopefully that they realize that, you know, they can't take life for granted,
Right.
or their freedom,
Right.
for that matter. I mean, like driving a car. Driving a car is a privilege, you see. It's not, it's something that's a privilege. I mean, it really is.
Yeah,
So I think the young people should realize that again, that freedom is not free.
And we all have to make sacrifices from time to time.
Exactly,
Varies
Tom.
with different people,
Yes, sir.
of course. Larry, thank you so much. It's been an excellent interview. We appreciate you participating in our Price of Freedom interview series and allowing us to preserve your military experience for the people of this community. And thank you, sir, for your service to our country.
Thank you, Mr.
very
Kennemer. I
much.
appreciate it.
it very much. If you'd like more information regarding this interview or any interview in our Military Heritage Series, please contact the Madison County Military Heritage Commission website at mcmhc.org.